Hello everybody, my name is Holly, and in this second webinar of the series I am going to be taking you through this idea of how to present an argument in an academic essay. Just so you know a little bit about me, I am a former OxNet Coordinator. I was based in London and I work really closely with Felix, with Pembroke College and with schools in London in the delivery of OxNet. I also graduated from Pembroke College in 2018 with a degree in history, so I am pretty well versed in these ideas of how to present arguments and essay writings and all the best ways in which to approach these activities. As with Felix's webinar, which was prior to this one, this should not take more than half an hour or so. And the idea is to give you an overview of the kinds of things that are really going to help you succeed at those top levels. Okay, to begin with, presenting an argument is core to any essay or any written response that you may do. So whether that be in an admissions test, whether that be in your A-level or your IB exams, if you don't have an argument to a written response, then there is not much point in writing the essay or the written response. The argument is the reason why you sit down to write in the beginning. So this webinar is designed to create a really strong, cohesive, subtle, concise argument that's really going to help you stand out from other kind of written responses and other candidates who would be responding to the same question as you, but you're going to be able to put that across in a much better and much more sophisticated way. Structure is really key to this, and in many ways, and this is something that I'm going to be saying and coming back to throughout this webinar, all of the ideas and tips and tricks that you've been taught or will have been taught up until now about structure are still completely relevant and still completely valid. So this idea of an introduction, the main body of your essay, which is really carefully evidenced and analysed and backed up, and then a short kind of concise conclusion at the end, all of that is still absolutely the same at undergraduate or kind of just pre-undergraduate level. It gets a little bit more subtle, and there are some tips and tricks that you can utilize within that broad essay structure, which differs a little bit once you get to university, and that's something that I'm going to come on to throughout this webinar. But in general, those main ideas that you will have encountered many, many times before are still absolutely pertinent to this idea of presenting an argument at a kind of high academic level. Admissions tests. So these will be upcoming for many of you, I am sure, at this point in the year. As with the previous point, the main structural ideas and concepts and kind of tips and tricks that you'll have been taught throughout your academic life up until now, whether that be through something like OxNet or within your A-level or IB lessons, if you do humanities essay-based subjects, those points and those ideas will still apply to admissions tests. And I think it's a really common misconception that candidates kind of come up against in their preparation for admissions tests, that they need to somehow do something completely radically different as part of that piece of writing in order to really impress and stand out and gain the highest marks. In actual fact, you don't. And simplicity in a structure and a really kind of logical, straightforward, clear way in which to present your argument is 9.9 times out of 10 the absolute best way to go forward. Okay, so following on from admissions tests preparation, as I've said, these are going to be broad questions. So if you're sitting something such as the TSA, so the Thinking Skills Assessment, if you're applying for a subject such as PPE, or the History Aptitude Test, if you're applying for history, or the MLAT for modern foreign languages, and to a certain degree the ELAT for English literature and language, you are going to be confronted with quite broad questions. This is purposeful. And it ensures that everybody is on a level playing field when they come into the exam. It's not something that you could do any specific revision for or prepare any specific information, and instead you are engaging with a question that you've come into the exam prepped with the same amount of knowledge as everybody else. So don't be intimidated by those questions. There will be quite a strict time constraint on answering these, and oftentimes, especially for the TSA, you will be expected to respond to a really broad question that academics probably spend their whole lives and whole careers working on in 30 minutes, and that's inclusive of preparation time as well. So you're up against the clock. So if you have in your mind a really clear structure and a really clear, logical plan of how you're going to approach those questions, you're going to be in a much better position to be able to do so. As I've said, your argument is absolutely crucial to this, as with an OxNet essay or with an IB essay or an A-level essay or even an undergraduate level essay. Your essay is not worth writing if you don't have an argument, and that is exactly the same for admissions tests. Admissions tutors want to be able to see evidence of a candidate who can sit down in recognisably difficult, stressful conditions and produce a strong, independent argument. It doesn't fall back on kind of prepared answers or shoehorned answers, but instead there's a really strong thread of an argument that runs throughout an essay or a written response. In the third webinar, I'm going to be talking more about source analysis. And in this sense, the idea of an argument is slightly different, but the premise is the same, that there is a really clear and consistent thread that runs throughout your essay, and it's really clearly demarcated and logically flows. In order to do this, you need to be able to plan, not just well, but really efficiently and effectively. And I'm going to be going through some tips and tricks for planning throughout this webinar. Again, structuring in your argument is completely crucial to this. Your essay may be nothing without an argument, but if your essay isn't structured correctly, the argument isn't going to come through. And we're going to be going through the best ways in which to structure your essays and your arguments in this webinar. Okay, so your argument is also known as your hypothesis or your thesis. This is the central answer to the question that you are responding to. It can be summarized in perhaps 2 or 3 sentences, no more than that. And it would be almost, if you imagine a kind of Q&A, your argument is the A part of that. So it could almost read as if you ask yourself the essay question and your argument is the direct answer that you have to that question. It won't be evidenced at this point. It won't be properly fleshed out. You won't have examples to back it up, but that is the core. Think of it as the nucleus of your essay, and quite a scientific example. This is what powers the whole of your essay. Again, your essay is absolutely nothing without your argument, and essays without an argument will not read very well. They won't answer the question, and they won't be sophisticated or nuanced or properly show your academic prowess. This is your response to the question, and I've put your in bold there. This is very individual. Your argument is based on your opinion, kind of the evidence that you've collated, your personal take on this specific question. It's not what the person next to you has responded to the question or what they've thought of it. In actual fact, in something like an admissions test essay, all of the responses that a tutor will receive will ideally be very, very different, and that's perfect. That is exactly what kind of a good set of answers should look like, because it's very individual, it's very personal, and it should be based on kind of your own perspective. Your argument should be clear from the very outset of your essay or from your written response. So it's not this kind of idea that you keep the reader guessing until you get to the conclusion. So it's quite counterintuitive in that respect. You need to set your argument out in your introduction. Your conclusion brings it all together. Your conclusion doesn't decide what your argument is upon weighing up the evidence throughout your essay. You, as an academic, you set out to write your essay, your contribution to the field, knowing exactly what it is that you want to write. And this is, I think, the key difference perhaps between school and sixth form and university level writing. I think in school and sixth form, there's a tendency to keep the reader guessing throughout as to what your argument is going to be, and you weigh up pros and cons throughout your essay before reaching your conclusion right at the end. In fact, at undergraduate level and postgraduate level and beyond, you set out with a really clear idea of what exactly your argument is going to be. You set that out in your introduction, which we're going to talk about. You evidence it throughout the body of your argument. So you back it up and you justify it and you analyze and you do all of those really key, crucial essay skills. And then in the conclusion, it's just a short summative paragraph that brings everything together. There is no new information brought in your conclusion. The reader should be able to take any part of your essay, whether that be the kind of the beginning, the middle, or the end, and from that they should be able to tell exactly what your argument is. So in a kind of really reductive, simple sense, they should be able to say whether or not you are arguing yes or whether or not you're arguing no. There's no point in sitting on the fence. Which brings me on to my my next point. You should be really clear on what your answer to any given question is, and we're going to go through an example of this so you can see what this kind of looks like in practice. You will not be awarded marks, or you will not write an essay that's particularly rigorous or impressive or sophisticated if you sit on the fence in relation to the question that is asked. You should have a strong stance which you are able to effectively argue throughout. And this is a difficult task, and it's something that definitely comes the more that you do it, especially as you get on to undergraduate level and you go through your university career. But there are some small things that you can start doing now to really kind of force yourself to take a specific view on the question that is posed. I think sometimes at A level or IB or going back to GCSE level, there is an expectation, and perhaps it's almost recommended, that you do sit on the fence and you recognise both sides of the argument and you position yourself somewhere in the middle. When I say avoid fence sitting, I'm not saying don't acknowledge any counter arguments, because that is clearly not what professional academics do. They recognise that there are counter arguments that operate in the opposite direction to their own argument, but they use them and they integrate them to bolster or enhance their own argument. So they say, in effect, this is my argument. I am aware that somebody else has argued differently, but I can show you why they are wrong and why my argument disproves their argument. So you're engaging with those counter arguments and you're engaging with kind of the counterfactual, but you're using it to enhance your own argument, not using it to show perhaps this is why I am wrong. Okay, as I've said, identifying your argument is a really difficult skill to be able to master. It involves a lot of confidence. Sometimes the best arguments are achieved through risk-taking. That is how kind of really original and sophisticated and interesting and engaging arguments emerge, through perhaps taking the question and doing something a little bit different with it. Not too different, because I think there also can be a tendency in these kind of responses to flip questions on their head and say, okay, you as an admissions tutor or an examiner have asked this question, I would have preferred it if you'd asked this question. No, the admissions tutor and the examiner has asked a specific question for a reason, and they want you to engage with that. So when I say doing something different with the question, it's within the very tight constraints of the specific question that's been asked. It's not taking certain parts of it and saying, actually, I'd prefer to go off in this direction, but really engaging in an original and thoughtful way with the terms that have been set to you. So the ways in which that you can identify what your argument is, because as I've said, this is really core and crucial to the essay, and you cannot sit down to write an essay without first having an argument. So what I would first do is take the question, and if this seems quite theoretical, on the next slide I'm going to put this into practice, but this is just to give you an overview of the process I suggest that you go through to create a really strong, original, efficient argument. Take the question that you're being asked and come down one way or another, yes or no. So, for instance, the question, which I know we've used before for OxNet essays, does inequality matter, yes or no? We know as academics, and you know as academics, that that question is huge, and there are a lot of grey areas and subtlety and nuance. And oftentimes, if you perhaps were in a debate with somebody, you wouldn't be so clear yes or no. For the purposes of academic writing, it's really, really crucial that you take a strong stance. There are lots of grey areas, and you can bring those into your argument and incorporate them as part of the nuance and subtlety of your essay, but you need to have a strong and decisive thread that runs throughout. So to start off, you decide yes or no. It may seem reductive to begin with and too basic, but we can flesh that out. Once you've decided yes or no, and this is really a matter of personal opinion, there's no right or wrong answer, then ask yourself why. Why yes or no? What has made you come down so decisively one side or the other? And I would write in bullet points, doesn't need to be more than bullet points at this stage. why you have decided yes or no. So is there a specific example that came to mind when you thought yes or no? Are there a specific set of facts that you've kind of encountered as part of wider reading, your A-level or IB work? Why is it that you've decided to come down on that side of the argument and not the other? Then, and this is where it comes into kind of really recognizing these grey areas and the counter arguments and the counterfactuals and all of the existing evidence. Are there any exceptions to the yes or no answer? If so, what are they? They might not be. You may be really decisive, yes or no, and you can really confidently and lucidly explain why. And that's brilliant. That's a really strong, decisive argument already set up for you, ready to go, write clearly, and justify. In many cases, such as perhaps for that example that I cited there, does inequality matter? You may have come down on either yes or no after a bit of thinking, but as you did so, you thought, but there's a situation in which I really think that inequality does matter, or there are a set of circumstances in which yes or no wouldn't perhaps work. What are those? Write them down again in bullet points so that you can see then the holistic nature of the argument. And so you've got your yes or no, your justification, which will form kind of the mainstay of your argument, and then those exceptions. Then you integrate those exceptions into your initial standpoint, and that's in a kind of, it's not all tied together neatly yet, but that is the essence of your argument. And what you're doing when you're showing those exceptions is showing that you've really thought about the nuance of the question, and you're showing awareness of those grey areas and showing awareness that there's not just a kind of one way of looking at the answer. You're showing that you can think about all of the different perspectives, but you're not doing so in a way that undermines your own strong argument. Then you pull it all together. This is perhaps the most difficult part of the process. If you would to be doing this in an admissions essay, you'd probably be doing this for something like the TSA in no more than 5 minutes, which is why I'm sure you'll all have been really implored to revise from past papers and try past papers. And even if you're not writing the full response out, at least going through a planning process such as this one, so that by the time you get into the exam, you're able to go through this process in 5 minutes and off you go with a really strong, original, efficient argument. So you pull it all together, and in its kind of final form, it will probably take up no more than 2 or 3 sentences. So for instance, and I do have another example that I'm going to come onto, but just to go back to that does inequality matter example, you may have decided, yes, inequality does matter. You explain why it does matter. And then, but then say if you'd thought of exceptions as part of this process, you could say, however, there may be a certain set of circumstances of X, Y, Z in which it is important to remember that inequality does matter in that kind of environment. Something like that. Very imperfect, but just as a kind of basic example of what that process may look like. That process I've just outlined there is the core part of your planning process. So I'm sure you'll all have been taught from GCSE, even perhaps before GCSE, that planning is absolutely integral to the essay writing and academic writing process as a whole. You should not set out to write an essay without first planning, no matter how confident you are. And being confident as an academic writer is a really brilliant quality to have, but even the most confident of academic writers will always set out and plan their response. If you don't plan, it won't be well structured, it will be messy, it won't be cohesive, it won't be nuanced. If you just take 5 or so minutes to plan your response, so 5 or so minutes would be something for a piece of writing such as an admissions test response. If you were to be writing an essay as an undergraduate, I'm sure many students would tell you that actually the planning process forms quite a considerable chunk of the whole essay writing process, perhaps a few hours. If you take even 5 minutes to plan for something such as an admissions test response, your response and your essay will be considerably better because it will be more focused and it will be more thoughtful. So identifying your argument is how you start off. Next, you identify the examples and the evidence that you will use in support of your argument. So you need to be able to justify your argument. Coming up with the strong, decisive, sophisticated, nuanced take on the question is perhaps the most difficult part of responding to that question, but it doesn't really mean anything unless you can back it up and justify it. So if you are writing a sentence, you need to make sure that it is substantiated and you're not simply making sweeping statements over and over again, because that isn't good academic practice and it won't get you the top marks. How will your argument progress? So I think we're all probably familiar with the idea that the introduction should form the beginning of your essay, and that's your argument. Then how are you going to prove that? How is your argument going to progress logically? How is it going to progress in the best possible way that justifies and proves your core argument? So what we would usually say for something like an undergraduate essay of around 2,000 or 3,000 words in length is that you would have 2 or 3 main points. So points aren't the same as paragraphs, and within that you would probably have multiple paragraphs, but 2 or 3 main points that flow logically on from each other in order to prove your argument. And this is a really personal thing, and it will only be achieved through proper planning. If you're able to set out everything that you want to write as part of your essay, as part of your response, only then will you be able to start joining up the links and seeing the most logical flow of those points. Again, think of this like a flow chart. It should flow kind of really logically from one point to the next. Okay, this is a question that I have taken from a previous TSA paper. And the question is a referendum a good way for a country to decide a major issue? So just to kind of go through some of those processes that I've spoken about there and show what they look like in practice. This is a completely hypothetical argument. It's not necessarily one that I believe, but for the purposes of this exercise, it's one that I have kind of construed in order to show you what planning can look like at this stage. So I've entered my TSA paper, I've opened it up, and I've decided that this is the question I'm going to respond to. I've got no more than half an hour to do so, again, inclusive of planning time. So I'm going to look at this question, and first of all, in order to construct my argument, I'm going to decide yes or no. Is a referendum a good way for a country to decide a major issue? For the purposes of this example, I'm going to say yes. So I'm not saying I'm going to weigh up all of the evidence and the examples that I can think of throughout the essay, and then I'm going to reach a conclusion right at the end. No, in many senses, I've reached my conclusion in my introduction. I've reached my conclusion, and that's why I'm setting out to write my essay. So yes, so I've come down one side of the argument or another, and I'm really decisive and strong on that. Now I need to explain myself and justify why I've said yes and not no. So for the purposes of this example, I've said yes, a referendum upholds democracy and increases public faith in the political system. So that's my why part of the argument planning process. Now I'm going to think, are there any exceptions? And so again, for the purposes of this example, I'm saying, however, the terms of the referendum must be clear. So an unclear referendum or a referendum in which terms aren't clear isn't a good way for a country to decide a major issue. And through doing that, I'm showing awareness of those grey areas. I'm showing awareness of them, but I'm not making the full essay an essay of grey areas. Instead, I'm coming down really strongly, yes or no. I'm justifying why, but I'm showing nuance and sophistication by saying, I've thought about it a little bit more, and actually there are some circumstances which need to be taken into account when thinking about the best way in which to run referendums. This then is my argument, and it forms my introduction. Then what I would do is break this down. So I have here the main body of my essay. And in many senses, once you have your argument, you've got your essay, because the points are ready made for you. So my first point would probably be that a referendum is a good way for a country to decide a major issue because it upholds democracy. And then I need to provide evidence and examples for that. My second point would be that it increases public faith in the political system. Therefore, it's a good way for a country to decide a major issue. Again, I need evidence for that. So whether there are any particular examples or books or articles that you've read as part of your curriculum or as part of some wider reading that you've done. Thirdly, and then I come on to this kind of exception idea, the terms, however, must be clear, and then provide also some evidence for that. And you can see when I was speaking there about the way in which an essay should almost be like a flow chart in its structure and the way in which it progresses. This here really clearly progresses from the main argument that I've come up with here, and that's my introduction, first point, second point, third point, and then you would have your conclusion. Again, a conclusion shouldn't be a long piece of writing, a couple of sentences for something like an admissions test, where you summarize, bring everything together, don't introduce any new information, but you're really kind of coming back to the points that you've already made in order to draw it all together. This would be slightly different for something like an undergraduate essay, in which a conclusion would do all of that, but it would perhaps do things like identify areas for further research, or at postgraduate level, perhaps kind of identify those omissions in the wider literature. So just to draw this all together with that question, so you can see here, this is a past TSA paper, so you can kind of see the similarly broad questions that are also asked. For the purposes of this one, I have broken down a response to the question, is a referendum a good way to decide a major question facing the country? So if I just minimize this here so you can see properly. So you start off with your plan, yes or no, why, exceptions, possible evidence or examples, and I've kind of delineated this here. Yes, it upholds democracy, it increases public faith in the political system. The terms of the referendum, however, must be clear. And then some possible examples are the 2016 Brexit referendum or the 2014 Scottish referendum. And those are possible examples, possible pieces of evidence that you could deploy as part of that essay. You could contrast and compare those referendums, you could use them as case studies, you could use completely different examples and evidence altogether. But those are the kinds of things that you should be thinking of in or as part of your planning process. Secondly, you would come on to your introduction. So once you've got your plan and your argument, you're all ready to go and start writing. Your introduction sets this key argument out, including the exceptions. The exceptions form a critical part of your argument, even though they perhaps don't fit neatly into this yes or no divide. In fact, it shows subtlety and nuance and sophistication. Conciseness is key. So at undergraduate level and pre-undergraduate level, you don't need to be writing large introductions. Once you perhaps get onto dissertation writing or postgraduate level, introductions are more likely to be a lengthier piece of writing, which sets out key literature and your wider reading and what other academics have said on the subject. But at this level, an introduction really does not need to be a long piece of writing or take a lot of time. Conciseness really is key, and you need to utilize the introduction as a vehicle to explain your argument and set out your own standpoint. You can then move on to the main body of your essay, and this is where you explain and justify your argument in a logical way, using evidence and examples where appropriate. Again, remember to paragraph. This may run counter to that idea of new point, new paragraph. That is very much the same, but in kind of broad senses, where our points for the purposes of this essay is it upholds democracy, increases public faith, and the terms of the referendum must be clear. Those are three separate points, but within those points you'd probably have a number of paragraphs. This makes it nicer to read. It makes sure that you're not being kind of overly verbose when you're writing or kind of complicating things. Conclusion, again, being concise is key. What you need to do is summarize the main points, no more and no less. I just open this back up. Okay, so as we've said there, just to kind of summarize, you have your introduction that includes your argument, perhaps how you're going to approach the question. This isn't as relevant perhaps for something like an admissions test, but for an undergraduate level essay, you may want to talk briefly about how you're going to approach the question or why you're going to approach it in that way. You have the body of your essay, which is your points, analysis and evidence. So when I said previously about not discarding all of those tried and tested methods of essay writing and essay structuring that you've learned perhaps from GCSE, one of those is actually PEE or PEA. It's quite simplistic, but actually the premise and the main idea of it is still very much relevant to academic writing at all levels. You need to make sure that you're properly explaining yourself, you're properly evidencing your points, and you're conducting that high level of analysis every time you kind of make a claim relevant to your argument. Conclusion, keep this brief, you're not introducing new information. So again, you can see that this structure isn't radically different to anything that you've learned as part of your school curriculum, or perhaps essay answers that you've done as part of your A-levels or your GCSEs or your IB. It's just about making sure that you're really confident with the way in which you're going to approach each part of the essay in this sense, because they all join together to kind of create a really cohesive piece of writing, but each one of them needs to be right, otherwise it's going to detract from the overall quality and the clarity of what you're saying. Think of an essay as having a cyclical structure. So you set your argument out in your introduction. By the time you get to your conclusion, you've done a lot of analysis and evidencing and justifying and explaining, but you've not reached anywhere radically different from where you started. You've used the body of your essay to prove your introduction. So by the time you get to your conclusion, you're right back where you started from, except you've evidenced it and you've explained everything. Your argument is unchanged beginning to end. Final tips. Be confident. The best academic essays are ones that take risks. They're ones that have really decisive, strong arguments. They're ones that perhaps argue something a little bit different. If you are approaching something like an admissions test and you open the paper and you're confronted with a set of questions from which you can choose, similar to that TSA example that I showed you previously, I would always implore candidates not to take or not to choose the question that they feel they know the most about. So, for instance, the most that they may have learned about as part of an A-level or an IB course, but choose the question that you find the most interesting, because that's the question that you are most likely to write a really engaging and original and thoughtful answer for. It may be that you can't supply as much evidence or examples as you would have been able to for the question that you know more about, but if you write an engaging and a thoughtful argument, it's more likely to be an original one. So I would always say, be confident, take a risk. The wonderful thing about academia is that as long as you can evidence and justify your points, there are no right or wrong answers. So be confident, and that will ring through in your writing. Always plan. Saying always be confident, even the most confident of academic writers always plan. If you don't plan, your writing won't read confidently, it won't be articulate, it will be a bit messy, it won't be tightly structured and ordered, and those are all of the kinds of things that admissions tutors and tutors who you would engage with at undergraduate level are looking for in a piece of writing. Write engagingly. I know the webinar prior to this one has loads of tips and advice on academic writing. Your writing is the vehicle for expressing your argument, so you need to make sure that's right. Just because it's an academic essay doesn't mean that it needs to be boring, and there are loads of different ways in which you can write that make for really engaging and interesting essays. Don't forget normal essay structuring rules. Just because you're entering perhaps a new stage of your academic career doesn't mean that you throw out all of the things that you've learned previously. Things like PEE, that really established essay structure of introduction, main body of your essay and conclusion, all stands really well still. Don't forget that. Just think about ways in which you can perhaps build on it, be more confident with it, and be more successful through going into things that you may not have approached before, such as admissions tests. That's all from me. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I wish you all the very best of luck if you are taking part in things such as admissions tests over the coming weeks, and I hope that some of the advice and the tips and the ideas in this webinar will prove useful for those.